The champagne flute hit the edge of my plate when my father set it down too hard, and that sound, that sharp little clink, is what I remember most clearly before everything changed. We were at my parents' house for Christmas dinner. 14 people around the table, my aunts, my uncle, his wife, 3 cousins, my grandmother at the head of the table the way she always sat, and my brother across from me, already on his second glass of wine before the food even came out. My father stood up the way he does when he wants everyone's attention, straightening his sweater, clearing his throat once. I remember thinking he was going to make a toast about the new year, about family, something generic that we'd all nod through and forget by dessert. Instead, he said, "I think it's time we talked about the plan for helping your brother get back on his feet." He was looking directly at me. "My name is Claire Sutton. I'm 32 years old. I'm the oldest of 2 children, and I have spent the last 9 years being the person my family calls when something goes wrong, which in my family is constantly. I have a good job. I'm a project manager at a mid-sized logistics firm outside of Columbus. And I have a 401k and a savings account and a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment that I chose for myself. These are things I built slowly and carefully because no one handed them to me. I didn't get the luxury of my mistakes being absorbed. I learned early that consequences were real, and I adjusted my behavior accordingly. My brother never had that experience. Not once." My father kept talking. He laid it out like a business proposal. My brother had lost his job 6 months earlier, his 3rd job loss in 4 years, and had been living with my parents since September. "They weren't asking me to take him in," my father said. "They understood I had a small place. But they were hoping I could cover his car payment for a few months, maybe help with his phone bill, and possibly—" He paused here, looking at the table, "cosign on a small personal loan so he could get some breathing room." Cosign on a loan. I set my fork down. I did it carefully, deliberately, so that I wouldn't throw it. "And what does he think about this?" I asked. My brother looked up from his wine glass. He shrugged, an actual shrug, like someone had asked him where he wanted to order dinner. That was the moment I understood something I'd been circling for years without ever quite landing on. This was not a conversation. It was an announcement. The plan had already been made. I was just being informed of my role. My mother reached over and touched my hand. "We know you've always been the responsible one," she said, and she meant it as a compliment. She genuinely meant it as a compliment. I looked around that table at the people I'd grown up loving, the people I'd driven 3 hours to see, and I felt something go quiet inside me. Not cold, not angry. Quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before you make a decision you've been postponing for too long. "I need to think about it," I said. Which was the first lie I'd told my family in years. I didn't need to think about it. I already knew. I'd known for a long time. My brother's name is Paul. He's 28. He's funny in a way that disarms people, quick with a joke, easy to like in the first 10 minutes of knowing him. My parents have always called him sensitive. They've always said he struggles in ways that are harder to see than the ways I struggled, that his challenges are internal, that he needs more patience and more grace. I believed them for a long time. The first time I helped him out financially, I was 24. He'd gotten behind on rent, and my parents couldn't cover it that month. It was $700. I gave it to him as a gift because he was my brother, and he'd just moved out on his own, and it felt like the right thing to do. He thanked me. He brought me a gas station candle as a thank you gift, the kind with the fake vanilla scent that gives you a headache after 20 minutes, and I kept it on my desk for a year anyway because it meant he'd thought of me. He never mentioned paying it back. I didn't bring it up. The second time, he'd gotten a parking ticket that turned into a boot, that turned into a tow, that turned into $260, or his car was being held at the lot. He needed it fast. I covered it. He said he'd Venmo me by Friday. Friday came and went. The third time was bigger. He'd signed a lease on an apartment he couldn't really afford, and 3 months in, he was 2 months behind. My parents called me on a Tuesday night and explained that if we didn't help him, he'd be evicted and they didn't have room for him at their place. And, this is the part I still think about, they said they were too old for this kind of stress. That phrase. Too old for this kind of stress. As if my stress had an age limit. As if my stress was irrelevant because I was young enough to absorb it. I covered the 2 months. $1,500. My brother texted me a string of heart emojis. After that, it just became the shape of things. Not always money. Sometimes it was time. driving him to the DMV because his license had lapsed and he couldn't legally drive, sitting on hold with his insurance company because he found the whole process overwhelming, showing up at his apartment to help him fill out paperwork for a state assistance program that he'd missed the first enrollment window for because he'd forgotten about it. I helped because it was always framed as urgent. I helped because every time I didn't, there was a consequence that landed on my parents, and I couldn't watch my parents suffer for my brother's choices. That's the trap they never tell you about. It's not that they guilt you directly, it's that they make the alternative feel impossible. I calculated once, sitting in my car in a parking garage because I didn't want to do it where anyone could see me. From when I was 24 to when I was 31, I had given or loaned my brother, with essentially no repayment, just over $22,000. Not counting time, not counting the emotional labor, just money that had left my account and not come back. $22,000 is a down payment. It's a year of graduate school. It's the emergency fund I was supposed to have and kept depleting and rebuilding and depleting again. I drove home from that Christmas dinner without saying goodbye to anyone. I told my mother I wasn't feeling well. She gave me a look that said she knew I was lying and that we'd be discussing this later, and I walked out to my car and sat in the driveway for 4 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. On the highway, I kept the radio off. I was trying to locate the feeling that was sitting in the center of my chest. Not anger, not sadness, something more fundamental. It took me until I was 20 miles outside of Columbus to name it. I was done. Not done with my family, not done in any dramatic way. Just done with the specific dynamic I had allowed to calcify over 9 years. Done with the assumption that my financial stability was a communal resource. Done with being the safety net that never got to have its own safety net. Done in the way you're done with something when you finally stop pretending you aren't. My mother called that night. I let it go to voicemail. She called again in the morning. I picked up the second time because I knew if I didn't, she'd escalate to my aunt, who would call me, and I didn't have the energy for the chain reaction. She opened with, "We didn't mean to put you on the spot." Which is interesting, because putting me on the spot in front of 14 family members at Christmas dinner is precisely what they had done. I let her talk. She explained that my father was worried about Paul, that Paul was in a dark place, that they weren't getting any younger and they needed to know I would step up. She used the phrase "step up" 3 times. Each time she said it, something inside me pulled tighter. When she finished, I said, "Mom, I'm not going to co-sign a loan for Paul." Silence. "And I'm not going to cover his car payment. I'm not in a position to do that right now." More silence. Then, "What do you mean you're not in a position? You have a good job." This is the part that people who haven't lived it don't quite understand. The way you have a good job gets deployed as evidence that your money belongs to someone else. As if income is proof of surplus always. As if there are no bills or debts or savings goals or emergency funds or simple desires to have something left over at the end of the month. As if my job existing means my money is available for collective use. Having a job doesn't mean I have unlimited money, I said. And even if I did, co-signing a loan isn't something I'm willing to do. She said she was disappointed. She said my father would be hurt. She said Paul needed me right now, and that family was supposed to show up for each other. I said I've been showing up for 9 years. That's why I'm out of runway. She didn't have an answer for that. She said we'd talk more when things settled down, which is what she says when she wants to end a conversation without conceding anything. We said goodbye. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after. The next few weeks were quiet in a way that felt like a held breath. My brother texted me twice. Once to say hey, which I responded to. Once to ask if I'd reconsidered, which I didn't respond to. My father didn't call, which surprised me. My father's silence always means something different from my mother's. Hers is temporary, a regrouping. His is a statement. What happened next I should have expected, because it's happened before in smaller versions. My mother called my aunt, my father's sister, who has always been close to me, who I love genuinely, and she made sure my aunt understood that I was going through something and that she should check in on me. My aunt called me the following Sunday. She was warm about it, careful, clearly briefed. She said she'd heard things were tense with the family, and she just wanted me to know she was there if I wanted to talk. I understood immediately. It wasn't a welfare call. It was a reconnaissance mission. My mother was trying to find out through my aunt what I was actually thinking because I had stopped telling my mother the truth. I told my aunt I was doing well. I said the holidays had been a little complicated, but I was okay. She asked if I wanted to grab lunch sometime soon, and I said yes because I meant it. She wasn't the problem here, she was just being used by the problem. And we made vague plans we both knew we might not keep. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a while and thought about how much energy this was already taking. The calls, the second guessing, the small acts of management my family was performing around my refusal. I thought about what it had cost me over 9 years to stay integrated in that system. Not just the money, the emotional overhead, the Sunday calls that always came with a check-in about Paul embedded somewhere. The way I'd learned to brace myself at family gatherings, waiting for the thing that would be asked of me, the particular exhaustion of being loved in a way that came with a price tag. I started keeping track, just in a notes app on my phone, of every time my family contacted me in those first 2 weeks of January. Not obsessively, just to see the pattern clearly. In 15 days, my mother contacted me 11 times. My brother contacted me 4. My father twice. Of those contacts, not one was purely to talk. Every single one had something embedded in it. A mention of Paul's situation. A gentle probe about whether I'd changed my mind. A story about how worried everyone was. Not one of them asked how I was doing. Not really. I made a decision around the second week of January that I want to be clear about. I did not cut off my family. I want that distinction to be understood, because people hear these stories and assume the ending is always dramatic, always complete, always a slammed door. That's not what I did. What I did was smaller and, I think, more honest. I stopped being available in the specific way I had always been available. I stopped picking up every call. I stopped responding to every text within the hour. I gave myself permission to let things sit without immediately solving them. And I stopped loaning money. Permanently. Not conditionally, not for now. Permanently. The practical step came a few weeks later. I'd been thinking about the cosign issue, not because I'd changed my mind about doing it, but because I wanted to understand exactly where I stood legally. I made an appointment with a financial advisor I'd seen once before, when I was setting up my retirement contributions. I laid out the full picture, what my brother had asked for, what the family dynamics looked like, what I had and hadn't agreed to. She was professional about it, non-judgmental, and she told me something I needed to hear from a neutral source. That co-signing a personal loan for someone with my brother's financial history would put me at real and significant risk, and that the fact that he was family was legally irrelevant if he defaulted. I knew all of this. But hearing it confirmed by someone with no emotional stake in my family made something settle in me. I also, on the advice of the financial advisor, pulled my full credit report. I wanted to make sure there was nothing on there I wasn't aware of. There wasn't. My credit was clean and I intended to keep it that way. But the act of checking, of actually looking at the document, made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. In control of my own financial life, like it was mine and no one else's. The call with my mother in early February was the hardest one. She'd moved from disappointment to something sharper, and she wasn't bothering to soften it anymore. She said I was being cruel. She said I was punishing Paul for things that weren't entirely his fault. She said my father had stopped sleeping well because he was so worried, and that if something happened to Paul, she wanted me to think about how I would feel. That last one, if something happened to Paul, hit exactly where it was meant to hit. That particular move, the implication of catastrophe, the suggestion that my refusal was somehow responsible for whatever worst-case outcome she was imagining. I'd absorbed versions of my whole life. It had worked every single time. This time I held still. I told her I loved Paul. I told her I hoped he got help. I told her that helping him financially had not helped him. It had never helped him, not in 9 years. And I had to stop pretending otherwise. She said I had changed. She said it like it was an accusation. I said I knew. We got off the phone and I sat for a minute with the feeling of it. It wasn't relief. It wasn't triumph. It was closer to grief. The specific grief of seeing something you've spent years hoping was different and finally accepting what it actually is. I loved my mother. I loved my father. I even loved my brother. In the complicated way you love someone who has cost you a great deal without ever seeming to notice. But love was not the same thing as availability, and I had been confusing the two for so long that I'd lost track of which was which. By March, the pattern had shifted. My mother called less. My brother had stopped texting entirely. My father sent me a birthday card. My birthday isn't until June, that I think was meant as an olive branch, or possibly as a test to see if I'd respond warmly. I sent back a thank you text because the card was genuinely nice and I wasn't trying to be cold. I was trying to be appropriate. Those are different things. I heard through my aunt that my brother had gotten a job. A real one this time. Warehouse work, steady hours, not glamorous but solid. I heard he'd moved out of my parents' house and into a place with a roommate. I heard he was managing his own bills for the first time in years. I'm not gonna pretend I felt nothing when I heard this. I felt a lot. I felt something that was partly relief, and partly something more complicated. The particular sting of learning that the thing you were told was impossible turned out to be possible once the safety net was gone. 9 years of being told he couldn't handle it. 9 years of stepping in to prevent the fall. And then the moment I stepped back, he figured out how to stand. That's the part that will stay with me the longest, I think. Not the money. Not the conversations. Just that. In April, I had dinner with my aunt, the one who'd been recruited as my mother's emissary back in January. By then the situation had settled enough that we could have a real conversation. She was honest with me, once I gave her an opening to be. She said she'd understood, even when she was calling me on behalf of my mother, that I wasn't wrong. She said she'd watched for years. She said she hadn't said anything because it wasn't her place, and because my parents weren't the kind of people who responded well to outside input, but she said she'd noticed. Being noticed, it turns out, is its own kind of relief. I've been thinking lately about what I would tell someone who was in the version of this I was living 5 years ago, still in the middle of it, still telling herself it would eventually stabilize. I think I'd tell her that the stability you're waiting for will never come from outside. You can't fund someone into readiness. You can't absorb someone's consequences until they become ready to face them. The only thing your sacrifice guarantees is that you end up smaller, and the person you're protecting ends up further from the experience of handling their own life. I'd also tell her that when you stop, it will feel like you've done something wrong. It will feel selfish, in a way that is almost indistinguishable from actually being selfish, because the people who benefited from your generosity will tell you it's the same thing. They'll use the same words. They'll tell you that you've changed, that you've become cold, that this isn't who you are, and you'll have to sit with the discomfort of knowing that they're wrong, that the person you're becoming is actually more honest than the person you were before, someone who gave out of fear rather than genuine choice. Someone who said yes when she meant no, because the consequences of no felt unlivable. The consequences, it turns out, were livable, more than livable. My apartment is very quiet these days. I mean that in the best way. I came home last Tuesday after a long day at work, and I sat on my couch and I didn't check my phone for an hour, and no one needed anything from me, and the silence was something I had earned. My savings account has a number in it that I haven't seen in years, not because I've suddenly been earning more, I haven't, but because money that used to leave has been staying. I'm going to Portugal in September. I've never been to Europe. I booked the flights on a Wednesday afternoon in February, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I cried a little when the confirmation email came through, which I know sounds strange, but it felt like proof of something, that I existed separately, that my resources were mine, that choosing myself was allowed. I don't have a tidy relationship with my family right now. We speak occasionally. My mother and I have coffee when I visit, maybe 3 times a year. It's careful, a little formal, nothing like what I used to imagine we'd be when I was growing up. My father and I talk about safe things, the weather, sports, logistics. My brother and I have not spoken since January, not because I closed that door permanently, but because he hasn't opened it. I think he might be ashamed, and I think that's his work to do, not mine. I don't know what the next year looks like. I don't know if things will get easier with my parents or stay at this careful distance. I'm not waiting for a particular outcome anymore. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I spent so long waiting for the situation to resolve, for Paul to stabilize, for my parents to recognize what they were asking of me, for the whole thing to finally make sense in a way that let me off the hook. I kept thinking there was a version of this where I didn't have to make a hard choice, where it all just sorted itself out. There wasn't. There isn't. The only version that existed was the one where I decided finally that my life was mine to live. I poured a glass of wine last New Year's Eve alone in my apartment, And I didn't make a toast. I just stood at my window and watched the city and thought about the year that had passed and what it had cost and what it had given back. It was the first New Year's in as long as I could remember that felt actually new, not just a calendar turning over while the same obligations carried forward. Actually new, in the sense that things were genuinely different, that I had made a choice and lived inside it and survived it and come out the other side someone I recognized. I raised my glass to no one in particular. I was enough of an audience for myself.